Stranger Than Fiction, is it great? So Stranger Than Fiction came out in 2006 to pretty mediocre reviews. A bunch of people came out of the theater really confused about what exactly it was they had just seen. And it was marketed as a comedy, but it just didn't quite feel like a comedy, despite the odd laugh here and there. And that's because it's actually not supposed to be a comedy. It's most certainly a drama, and the comedy elements are mostly due to the excellent chemistry of the cast creating levity in otherwise tense moments. Honestly, it's incredibly hard not to view Will Ferrell as an inherently funny character, and a bunch of people never got past that mental block. Which is truly unfortunate in my mind. It is a bit hard to decipher what's going on in Stranger Than Fiction, and to get past the fact that this is a movie starring Will Ferrell that isn't a comedy. But once you do, it becomes an excellent film, well worth your time. Its deeper meaning and wonderful acting, as well as the beautiful art throughout, make it a standout film next to almost all other films of this genre. So let's dive into it. So right off the bat, we're introduced to Harold, a lowly IRS agent with an obsession with quantifying everything around him. Ironically, despite his acute awareness of his surroundings, he's seemingly oblivious to the outside world beyond what small areas he's comfortable with. Early on, he begins to hear a voice narrating his every action. Quickly, his actions are narrated to the point he no longer has a choice in them, but he's instead acting in time to the narration. With his fate now drawn out in front of him, he feels ashamed at the benign nature of his life. At first, he attempts to ignore the narrator, right up until he is told of his own approaching death. After that, he's forced to listen once again to this voice more closely. And it's from here where we begin to get the meta-narrative of Harold speaking to Professor Hilbert about this narrator Karen. This section of the movie creates a narrative over the movie itself and is by far the most interesting part of the film. Within these scenes, the professor helps Harold discover the nature of the stories. He does this by analyzing the mechanics of the story, first focusing on common plot devices, and then by determining the genre. Through this, he unveils the disingenuous nature of a story. Not this story, but any story. Okay, so what do I mean by that? First off, let me explain that both Professor Hilbert and Karen are a reflection of the actual writer of Stranger Than Fiction, Zach Helm. That is what I mean by meta-narrative. We have someone speaking to us about something outside of the film. Through both Professor Hilbert's discussion as well as Karen's narration, we have an interesting reflection made where both of these characters reflect Zach Helm's inner idea. The narration that is provided by Hilbert is one of analysis. He breaks the story down in a very uncaring and emotionless way, pointing out the underlying structure that the rest of the story clings to. He disregards the human aspect, instead focusing on the mechanics at play from a writing perspective.
Only a character.
Which is by no coincidence exactly what Karen is doing to Harold by narrating his life. It would seem that Zach has something to say about the agency of a writer in a story, and how that affects the story itself. We see Karen critiqued by a fellow writer and by Harold himself throughout the film. While Hilbert has much to say on the style of writing, he has nothing to say on the subject. On the other hand, though, Harold is indifferent to this style, but is beside himself with anger over how simply his life has been broken down and presented by Karen. By being aware of his presence in a story, we can see how Karen's narrative with Alma, the romantic interest, is entirely beyond Harold's own actions. He didn't choose to meet her, or flirt with her, or bring her flowers. The narrative of the story forced this change despite Harold's protests and attempts to avoid this progression. The necessity of rising action and plot progression force his character to this next step. A step we can assume he never would have pursued, likely preferring to continue his rather benign life as he had before the onset of the film. This idea sums up what the whole movie is about. Zach Helm, through his convoluted multi-narrative story, is trying to get across the concept of how a story's control over a character forces the characters to act in a certain way. In ways that, while fitting to a narrative, are far less human than the uninteresting realities of life. Harold is an IRS agent. He's an IRS agent because that is the epitome of boring and mundane. He was chosen for that role by Zach Helm because it highlights a very human personality that is pretty uninteresting. The reality of a person like this does not form a story that one could enjoy. It is only through the bending of reality to change slight things within the character that a writer can frame these people within a story. Yet by doing so, the writer takes away a part of the character that made them real, turning them into an object rather than a person. This point is concreted by Harold's watch. Harold's watch is personified by Karen at several different points during the film. She states it's trying to warn him or prevent him from missing an opportunity, etc. During these periods, the watch acts impossibly, having sirens go off and wacky light displays just appearing out of nowhere. Here, instead of the example of Harold being turned into an object, we have the opposite example of an object being turned into a character by the writer Karen. Zach Helm has this weird bit in here to create an example of writer's agency to reinforce his point. You see, Karen adds characteristics to the watch, changing it from an ordinary object to a sentient character. The watch in Stranger Than Fiction is given purpose and action the same way that Harold himself is, to the point that it is praised by Karen as a hero by the end of her novel. In the case of the watch, we find it absurd, yet with Harold, we hardly even notice. Stranger Than Fiction is trying to show us how, in a way, these things are actually equivalent. That stories are just that, and by the necessities of what makes a story up, the characters in them lose part of themselves in order to facilitate the requirements of the story. It's something natural to storytelling, but it's something that is disingenuous to real life. That's why at the end of the film, Karen decides to tank her own story in order to protect Harold from dying. Both her and Hilbert agree that it was a worse ending, but she makes an offhanded point about how it's best to keep people like Harold alive. And since she now knew that he would die knowingly, it wouldn't be what she intended anyway. When I first saw this ending, I was pretty disappointed.
Once Karen
but
is
now after
confronted
having
by
come
Harold,
to better
he stops being a
understand the
character
film,
to her
I find it
and
to
is
be
then
a
a person
soothing ending
instead.
to this movie. It makes sense then that this person does not fit the structure of the story she had made, because the whole movie has been trying to say a person is so much more than a character, and people don't fit into stories. Karen's comment about him being a different man than she intended fits so perfectly with this subtle message presented to us throughout the film that now I enjoy the ending of the film quite contently. I find it very compelling to see a film take such a large amount of effort to present such an abstract idea. I also really enjoy that it doesn't take time to explain any of this, but just lays the clues out for you to find yourself. Leaving the watch in there is a nice red flag that there is something more going on in this movie than what you might initially think. So let's boil it down. At the end of the day, Stranger Than Fiction is a wonderfully colorful film, with truly excellent performances out of the entire cast, particularly Will Ferrell, whose scope in this film honestly made me appreciate him more as an actor than I already did before. The story itself is a nice artsy analysis of storytelling and how the lens of writing changes the scope of reality. The concept is pretty damn artsy, and honestly it's a bit of a hassle to get your head around all of it. That said, once you understand what it is that this film is going for, it's a very nice piece of cinema. It's not for everyone, but if you're looking for something that compels you to think a little deeper and consider the medium a little more actively, then this is a great film. In light of how unwieldy it is and because of all of the meta-narrative going on, I give it a solid 8 out of 10. It's a great movie if you're in the mood for something a bit out there. So that was Stranger Than Fiction, and wow, they crammed a lot in there. I enjoy it, and I like it, and I think it's a fun movie, but damn, it's pretty artsy. Like,
pretty artsy, but not in the don't get it confused with like short bus artsy. This is like artsy but on the mainstream. Like, it's just really on the nose about knowing what good writing is and just reflecting on structure. I know I'm of a certain opinion here, but I just had this lumped together with things like Yes Man, which also tries to be artsy and young, and just I'm a little biased there. Yes Man was terrible. This is a really nice drama.
Oh yeah, it does a better job than something like Yes Man, or like Bruce Almighty, or what's another one? The Invention of Lying.
There, and artsy as well.
Yeah, all three of those films kind of have an artsy aspect, and they talk about religious themes or the idea of like opening yourself up to the world. And this movie isn't about any of that. And it does seem like that at first. And, a lot of people have that perspective looking in, and that's why it got brushed under the rug. Because this movie, well, it's artsy. It's not talking about God. It's not talking about religion. It's not talking about personally opening yourself up. It's talking about story structure. And it's weird. It's well done. It's pretty unique. I I don't know. I can't think of anything else quite like it. Like you can write it off as artsy, but it's a particular kind of direction.
You could see this film as having the goal to make you feel like a writer who. I don't want to spoil the ending, but that bitterness the two writers have in the one room when they're talking about that thing. No spoilers, but the audience feels it as well. Everyone is. It's just not as good.
Yeah.
Creates that with everyone.
Yeah, and it's intentional. It's definitely meant to be like that. And there's a lot of care and a lot of thought into it, and that's why I think it's a great movie. But it's still a lot to bite off, you know? When you try to cram that much into a narrative, you really cloud your story, and it makes it tough to root out what you're doing with it. And I don't blame, critics and everyone for writing this off quickly. It took me a lot of viewings, and a lot of that was happenstance that I ended up watching it repeatedly to start understanding what was going on.
Yeah, I knew what it was for years. I didn't watch it until the other day.
So what do you guys think? Let's cut it there. Do you guys think that Stranger Than Fiction is about this narrative structure and the idea of how being in a story changes the way characters act? Or do you think it is just like Yes Man and Bruce Almighty? Because maybe I'm wrong, maybe I am interpreting all of the messages in here wrong, but do you agree with me? Do you think there's something else going on here? Let me know in the comments below, and like and subscribe. See you guys.
See ya.